I want to do it all together. I kind of philosophically, I suppose, I want to be part of nature. I don't want to destroy it in my fields and then somehow compensate for that somewhere else.
Hey folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Today's guest is Guy Singh-Watson, the founder of Riverford Organic Farmers. For our non-UK listeners who maybe haven't heard of Guy, he's a bit of a business and farming legend in the UK. After growing up on his family's dairy farm and then becoming a management consultant, Guy actually returned to the farm and created Riverford Organic Farmers, which in 2 stages he actually completely sold to employees, probably for less than he could have gotten on the public market, so the company could stay true to its values. I've been a subscriber to Riverford's veg boxes since I got to England a few years ago, and just so you're aware, Riverford is in no way paying or sponsoring for this episode. Guy's just created a company with full respect for nature, and I really admire his individual leadership on key issues related to healthy food production for people and planet. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Guy Singh-Watson, founder of Riverford Organic Farmers. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we have Guy Singh-Watson, farmer and founder of Riverford Organic Farmers. Thanks for joining us today, Guy.
Very happy to be here, Rick.
I want to start with something I found on the Riverford website. It talks about how you still spend more time in the fields than the boardroom. So I also read that you're a former management consultant and now you're a farmer and entrepreneur and have been for the last couple of decades. So how do you define your relationship with nature?
It's just what makes me feel good. I like being outside. I find it very difficult, having established and developed a business which ended up employing over 1,000 people, now co-owners of that business, that inevitably involves a lot of meetings which tend to be inside, and I find that just doesn't really work for me. It doesn't feed my soul. I completely acknowledge that they are a requirement of running a large organization. You have to have structure and systems and good communication and everything. Somewhat reluctantly, I acknowledge the need for those things, but they don't work for me. I mean, I need to be outside. I'm very much a doing person. I like making things. And, when I woke up this morning, I was thinking about the hedge that I'm laying, and is the chainsaw sharp, and how I'm going to weave those branches together. And that's, I don't know. I like making things. I really like being outside and doing that with nature. So that, that's on the farm. Making stuff, repairing stuff, building an irrigation system, whatever. And if I'm not working, I'll be sitting on my surfboard somewhere. And that's just what I like doing.
One of the reasons I reached out to have you on the podcast, there was a piece you wrote in the Wicked Leaks newsletter and website about how your view of the land from your surfboard in your home of Devon has changed since you were a kid. Being so connected to the land, spending time outside, being a farmer, but also a surfer. How have you seen things change, both as a farmer and a surfer, in your lifetime?
Well, I think we're all conditioned to think that things aren't changing. I mean, there's this thing of baseline readjustment. You just get used to what it was yesterday as opposed to what it was 5 years or 50 years ago. But if I do, looking at the landscape, I think, and I remember what was planted in that field 50 years ago, and you think, oh my God, how much things have changed. And, my favorite beach is a very rocky little cove, where I'm almost always the only person there. And I've been going there. My parents used to take me there between milkings, 60 years ago, I suppose. So I paddle out and I look back at the landscape, and on those very small fields, they used to grow early potatoes and cauliflowers. There were, crab and lobster boats pulled up on the beach where I'm, jumping with my surfboard. And, it has all just changed so much. And you can look at that landscape and it tells you a story, of the enclosures that were formed. Actually, it was one of the earliest areas in the UK to be enclosed, to have field boundaries to fall into private ownership. And, you can see those field boundaries still there today. And you can sort of plot the rise and fall of British farming, I suppose, and the fact that food now is only, the actual production of food is now 1.6% of GDP, which kind of implies that, each farmer has to feed, I don't know, 60, 70 people or so. and you don't do that with the sort of agriculture that was happening, when I was a child. So, things have changed hugely. And I feel very sad for the most part the way it's changed. The greater scale, greater intensification, pollution, soil loss, biodiversity loss, and of course, climate change. Agriculture has certainly contributed its share. We could argue about how much, but most people would say somewhere between 15 and 30%. The agricultural policy in the UK I've got to say, over my lifetime, mostly it has been a disaster. It's particularly disastrous at the moment.
And I think most people don't necessarily first think of a farm as nature. Yet I'm sure, in your experience and some of the folks that I've talked to in the past in the food industry who are deeply connected with farmers, they talk about healthy farms as thriving ecosystems. And I know you're really passionate about supporting farmers. So can we have this sort of healthy relationship with our food and the people who produce it without having a healthy relationship with nature?
Well, I think there's a sort of divide, and amongst the people that I respect and read and listen to, there are two schools of thought, really. I mean, one is that, yeah, we try and coexist with nature, try and produce food in an environment where we can harbor biodiversity and sequester carbon and control runoff of water and so on. And that's very much my camp, that I want to do it all together. I kind of philosophically, I suppose, I want to be part of nature. I don't want to destroy it in my fields and then somehow compensate for that somewhere else. But there is another school of thought supported by a lot of people who I really respect, people like George Monbiot, who lives locally, is that we should really go for an uber intensive production. And by doing that, perhaps, free up other land, which can be rewilded. And, I can see the argument for that in some cases. But, we live in the Anthropocene. I mean, humankind has shaped our climate, our biodiversity, and even now our geology. And I just think we just need to accept that, but also accept that we are part of nature. We're deeply embedded within it, and just learn to be a lot smarter about it. So I really like the intimate association of a complex farm with many enterprises, which probably includes some animals, but not as many as we have on most farms today, but perhaps in smaller scale enterprises. And that, has an intimate juxtaposition with nature. So they're corridors. We have these huge hedgerows in my part of in Devon. They're a phenomenon, really. They are, and we're letting ours grow up and outwards. So they form these fantastic corridors for wildlife without having any significant impact on production. In fact, they provide cover. They provide heating fuel for, the farm and so on. I strongly believe that the two can coexist together, but it's going to be much more complex. It's going to require a lot more skills from our farmers who will have to go back to, I look back with admiration on my parents and my grandparents' generation. My father used to keep sheep, chickens, pigs. He used to grow grain, and the dairy herd was always, the biggest thing on the farm. But, and then they used to have cider and make, cider orchards and make cider. And they had to know how to prune an apple tree, how to maintain the sheep that grazing underneath. The level of skill was just extraordinary. And those skills have just been lost from our countryside. The only skill that can be afforded is the skill that allows you to make money out of essentially a single enterprise farm, normally, growing monocrops and or a highly industrialized form of animal agriculture. I do feel very sad, and I do lament the direction that British farming has taken, and it's pretty much the same around the world. It hasn't moved as fast in continental Europe as it has in the UK. I think in the US, you probably have the pride of having the very worst agriculture anywhere in the world. In terms of what you've done to nature. It's from what I see, it's pretty devastating. And maybe because the US is so vast, everyone feels that they can, there's plenty of space, and I'm sure there are spaces for nature. But yeah, certainly the agricultural production you've sort of led the world, and I'm not sure you've led it in the right direction.
Yeah, I think amongst the many things that the United States has exported culturally and such around the world, the McDonald's and Starbucks of the world, there also have been quite harmful agricultural practices, I think, that have led people down the wrong path. And it's sort of interesting because I was reading this about this project you're engaging with on your own farm to plant hazelnuts and walnuts, and you note that it's not actually about economics. It's not about that point that you just made about making money, but it's actually about the biodiversity. So, as a successful business person, and you clearly care about the nature and the environment, like how do you balance the two? How do you balance that biodiversity with the need to make money and support, sort of the feeding a nation in a lot of ways, I guess?
Okay, well, I mean, about 20 years ago, probably 25 years ago, I went to Uganda actually to visit some farmers that I had contacts with there. And most of the agricultural practice was pretty upsetting. There was still a lot of burning of bush to grow crops and stuff. But there was also the best agriculture I've seen anywhere in the world. These sort of smallholder farmers, typically 1 to 2 acres, multi-canopied approach, and obviously, it's right on the tropics in southern Uganda, at least. There's plenty of rainfall. It's just unbelievable how quickly things grow. And that left me, appreciating, just how productive a more natural system that maintained ground cover and used multiple canopies and then mixed animals and crops together, just how productive that could be. In the case in Uganda, 20 times more productive than the monocultures next door by my calculations. And I came back and I was on my own farm, and I suppose I've just slowly, that influenced my thinking quite a lot. And I've slowly started trying to look for forms of agriculture that sort of mimic that, and planting the hazelnuts and walnuts in quite widely spaced rows, with animals grazing underneath. I think we can get the same amount of production from the animals, and in terms of edible protein, about 4 times as much from the nut trees as well. So the whole system will be 5 times as productive. It will sequester considerable amounts of carbon. I don't think anyone can accurately calculate how much, but it will certainly sequester carbon. It will certainly harbor greater biodiversity. We'll certainly get less runoff from the fields. And it just seems to be a win-win-win. But the reason why it's not a commercial system is because we are generally a bit outside of the climatic zone for those nuts. But obviously with climate change and the lifetime of the trees, I'm anticipating that we'll fall comfortably within them. Though who knows exactly what will happen with climate change. So, but because I'm not doing what my neighbors are doing, and I'm doing it in everywhere in the world, even nut production, even a perennial crop has moved towards much shorter lived monocultures with a scorched earth approach to underneath to mainly to facilitate harvest. The trees are often now irrigated. Even what is a perennial crop, which should be pretty environmentally benign, we've managed to, humankind and the ingenuity of agriculture has managed to turn even that into an environmental disaster. And I know, again, you have that in the States, with the almond production, which people talk about a lot. But the same is going with olives and almonds and hazelnuts, moving them into, uber intensive orchards where everything can be more easily mechanized. But it's turning something which should be a positive thing into a negative thing. So I'm trying to grow nuts in a different way, where they will be there for longer, they're wider spaced, there will be more biodiversity, but that does mean it's quite challenging how we're going to harvest the nuts, because the ground won't be as even. And actually, I've chosen to plant them on a really stupidly steep field, with a 25% gradient, which certainly was a mistake. But because I was trying to prove that this is third grade agricultural land, which is no use to anything else, but it can be productive. We don't need to just rewild all this land. It can be farmed. And I was trying to sort of show that there was a path that livestock producers could take to a more environmentally friendly, less methane emitting form of agriculture. And the reason I've been able to do that and take those risks is because I made my money, really, if I'm honest. I love farming, but I made my money, selling vegetables. And in the end, after 35 years, I made my money by managing a brand. And that's how everyone makes their money. No one makes their money in this world producing anything. They make money by selling stuff, and then they make money by selling it at a premium price by branding it. And, that's just much as I kind of lament it, I mean, that's the reality of the world. But I am at least using the money that I've made to try and, put it back into farming and in a good way. So I hope that in my remaining years that I will prove that system can work. And ideally, it'll be a system that other people can benefit from and use on their farms locally. In reality, I think there's a hell of a lot of thinking and talking to be done to define what good farming is. And I suspect it's going to be very difficult to define it because it will be very, very locally specific, depending on, your topography, on your soils, on your climate, on your culture, on the food that people want to eat locally. All those things will define what good farming is. And it will be very different, where I farm, even from the east of England, let alone the US or Uganda.
How do we manage that or disseminate that information when we're thinking about more regional food systems? Like, how do we make sure everyone has the knowledge, but also access to markets and ways to sustain a living when it does look like it might need to be a balance of approaches in a very regional food system? Like, how do we make that work for farmers?
Yeah, well, that's something I spend quite a lot of time thinking about. I mean, essentially, how are you going to pay for reskilling and adding a complexity back into farming, which requires those skills? And that probably, certainly, I mean, around on the landscape around me, that is not going to be large scale farming because, ours, is very small, steep fields running into valleys. Every field is different. I mean, the soil type changes every 10 meters and so on. You cannot farm it like a sort of prairie. It just won't work. So it needs to be farmed in a smaller scale way. So how do you guarantee those smaller scale farmers a reasonable living? So such that if someone's skilled and knows what they're doing, they can. And it is very, very difficult because I come back to that point that agriculture, at farm gate prices generates certainly less than 2% of GDP, which means, it's all got to be done very, very cheaply. And it's hard to do that on a small scale because on a small scale, you don't have the benefits of, mechanization and so on. So does that mean people are going to have to pay more for their food? I hope that's not the case. The reality is that in my lifetime, the amount that a farmer, and I'm talking about vegetables here because that's really what I know about. When I started, I used to get somewhere between a third and 40%. So high 30s of the retail pound went back to the farmer for vegetables. We're now down to 25% and it's slipping. Now that may not seem in 30, 35 years a huge change, but it bloody well is if you're a farmer, 34 years ago, you were getting 50% more for your produce, essentially. Well, that makes a huge difference about how you run your farm. So, I mean, I would love to think that somehow why is it that the primary producer, always has to accept a smaller and smaller and smaller part of the retail pound? All gets sucked out of our economy and funneled into the pockets of people who own Google and Facebook and people who own property and shares, as opposed to people who actually do something tangibly bloody useful with their life. But yeah, how we reward farmers properly in a world where their income, as I say, is less than 2% of GDP. I'm sure it'd be less than that in the States. Yet we're contributing to, let's say, 20% of climate change and over 50% of loss of biodiversity. I mean, clearly our agriculture needs to be shaped not by, I would say, laissez-faire, neoliberal, free market forces. It needs to be shaped by intelligent, well-considered policy that balances the needs of food and food security, which we don't, we import at least 40% of our food in the UK, so we're certainly not food secure. Farming could address, climate change and biodiversity loss, but not if you just leave it exposed to, free market forces, which have just pushed it more and more towards monocultures and intensification and away from the sort of complex farming that I think most people want to see.
Thanks so much, Guy, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to put this episode out for our listeners to check out.